Well, welcome to session 4 on job analysis. Once again, I have to point out that I have my friend back over my shoulder, my left shoulder here, Maggie May, and hard telling what she's going to do during the video, but we'll try to ignore her. Right now, she seems to have an itch that needs scratching. Well, session 4 is about job analysis. Can you feel the excitement building? I bet you're all sitting there on the edge of your seat just tingling with anticipation. And for those of you fortunate enough to be experiencing those sensations right now, I'm a bit worried. You know, the reason it worries me is because you're going to be disappointed. Job analysis is boring, at least in my opinion. A few years back, my wife and I were with my daughter and son-in-law on a trip to Dallas, Texas. We were all attending a conference, and during one of those days off, we rented a car and took a tour of the surrounding area. Now, my wife and I lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and that vicinity for 2 years right after we were married. Naturally, our tour concentrated on finding our old abodes and hanging out places and marveling at how the place had changed in only 40 years. Imagine that. And we also were telling story after story about our young adventure in Texas. Our daughter and son-in-law nodded their heads appropriately, intoned surprise and astonishment for over 4 hours. Later, they confessed that it was one of the most boring times of their lives. But they did it because they felt they had to. They had to endure it because it had positive outcome for someone else, namely my wife and I. Such as job analysis. It's necessary. You have to do it. And it has a positive outcome for others. But it's still boring. Now, I'm sure compensation specialists would vehemently argue that point, but to each his own. It is indeed a very necessary task and one that is important for organizations. You must have a way to describe jobs and specifically the talents, traits, and skills needed to perform those jobs. Further, you need to have some mechanism to evaluate jobs, some way to compare jobs one to another and place a value on them so that pay is appropriate to the contribution of the job to the organization. And you also have to need to know how much to pay people when you're hiring them. That's obviously important, but it still doesn't make it any less boring. Now, in this lecture, I'll start out with a brief recap of where we've been. You know, it's important to stop at some point and review and put into context the topics we've already covered. We'll then launch into the topic of job analysis, leaning heavily on the text material. The authors do a good job of covering the topic, and I'll only try to add a bit of clarity here and there. But once again, we use job analysis in our personal lives, but we just don't even realize it. You know, when you decided to enroll in college, I bet one question that bounced around in your brain was, I wonder what a college student really does. I wonder what skills I need to be a good college student. I wonder what college professors expect and require. Is it different than high school? You started collecting data, and in your head you developed a description for students, and that list of specifications you could compare yourself to. You engaged in job analysis of the student's occupation, and that was an important step to prepare you to be a student and to be successful. It's real life. Let's explore the boring but real world of job analysis. Sometimes, as we go forward in classes, we tend to treat each session as a separate learning activity and miss the connection between important topics. So before we go jumping off into job analysis, let's do a little recap and figure out just exactly where we are, and perhaps more importantly, where we're going from here. In the first 3 sessions, we have really been focusing on a rather high level in the organization or on things external to the organization. We spoke of jobs in passing, but didn't really dive down into the guts of the organization. Well, this week we're getting to the guts part. We will be talking about determining what people do on the shop floor or on the sales floor, or in the patient room, etc. But we can't forget those high-level things we discussed earlier. The organizational structure and strategy, the business strategy, and the legal climate define what jobs do and to a certain extent how they do it. They define what job content is necessary to be successful while performing those jobs, which ultimately leads to organizational success. How can we possibly look for and find good people who will lead us to success if we don't understand what those good people need to do once they get in our organization? So the link between strategy and jobs is a straight line, and it's quite obvious. I guess what I'm saying is, it's a fact that the basis for selecting the right person for any job is an understanding of what is needed to do that job. Sounds simple, but there are many methods and tools available to gain that understanding, as the text indicates. Actually, it's more than merely understanding. It's being able to communicate those details to others so there is consistency in our recruiting and selection efforts. Everyone involved in the staffing, selection, and recruiting process must sing from the same songbook in terms of what is required and desired in the job. And that songbook comes from job analysis. If there is chaos in the understanding of the job and what is required to perform the position effectively, then there will be chaos in the ultimate selection decision. And that kind of chaos creates bad outcomes for organizations. Simply put, poor job analysis and poor descriptions make us look for the wrong things in our staffing efforts and makes us pay for the wrong things when we in our pay and reward system. Either we look for the wrong traits and skills because we have identified the wrong task that must be accomplished, or if the job description is outdated, we look for the things we needed yesterday and not today and tomorrow. Either scenario is bad. The text defines job analysis as, quote, the process that staffing professionals use to first identify the task required by a job and then evaluate what is required to perform each of the tasks that comprise the job. The process can be a strategic tool that results in a competitive advantage if it aligns with the requirements of the job and the company business strategy, taking into account what is required to perform the job today as well as in the future. End quote. Our tendency is to envision a process where job analysis lists the skills or traits of a job. We can then take that list and search for the individual who possess those traits. It's like a checklist. The applicants have this and this and this, but don't have that and that. And that's true to a point, but it's a little more complex than that. It's not only about what skills and traits are needed, it's about how much of those skills and traits are needed. And it follows that it's not only about what skills are possessed by applicants, it's also about how much or to what extent do applicants possess those skills. Because knowledge, skills, and traits are not finite commodities. Using a sports analogy, a lot of people can throw a football and do so accurately. But how accurately and how far can they throw? And can they throw it quickly enough or with the right finesse? So when looking for a pro football quarterback, how much is more important than the mere presence of the trait? And identifying and measuring how much is needed or possessed is a real tricky part. If we are preparing a dish, such as in cooking, we know what we want it to look like in the end. But there are many variables that affect that outcome. Although the dish may look the same regardless of where it's prepared and who prepares it, the dish may taste very different. The variation in taste comes from the different amounts of ingredients included. We make our dish spicier or saltier or more dry or moister, etc. Jobs may look the same on the outside, but internally they may be very different depending on the mix of knowledge, skills, abilities, and tasks and responsibilities that make up the final product. That's dependent upon the organization, current situation, resources available, to name just a few of these situational factors. I'm sure you have watched these cooking shows on TV and noticed that there is a particular recipe for a specific dish. But the chef doesn't follow the recipe as described. Instead of meticulously measuring a teaspoon of salt, the chef merely sprinkles the salt based on how he or she feels about the dish. Instead of measuring 3 cups of water, they merely pour water into a bowl until it feels or looks right. I, on the other hand, meticulously measure each ingredient. I follow the recipe to the letter. That's why I cook and I don't create. Chefs practice the art of cooking, and I merely cook. We use the same ingredients, but just in different proportions, depending on the situation and the variables at hand. So you can see the difficult part of filling open positions in an organization is coming up with a list of skills, traits, etc. It's not coming up with a recipe, it's identifying how much. I don't know about you, but if I'm running a fine restaurant, I want a chef and not a cook. When running a successful company, I don't want someone who has the right list of traits. I want someone who has the traits in the right proportion. Successful organizations hire HR professionals to create job analysis processes like chefs create dishes, not cooks. Pick a job, any job. Student, baker, attorney, firefighter, welder, teacher, quarterback, coach, HR professional, president of the United States. All our jobs we see all the time, but what do they really do and what is really required in that particular job from incumbents? What traits and skills are necessary to accomplish those activities? And not only accomplish them, but accomplish them well. We see these jobs constantly, but still can't fully discern the task and requirements of those jobs. An effective job analysis process identifies the properties of the job in the right proportion as in an objective manner as possible. I should also point out that as objective as possible implies that it is not a completely objective process. Job analysis still requires some subjective assumptions and decisions. It depends on the judgment of the job incumbents and others. When doing a job analysis or when hiring for, let's say, human resource professional, I may require 7 to 10 years experience. But based on the current situation and anticipated needs, I may require nearer 10 years experience and desire that experience be in the electronics industry. Same ingredients, but different proportions. Let's look at the job of the President of the United States. That job description and specifications fill the airwaves every day, and we all have our own idea of what is really involved in doing a good job as president. I bet if we all wrote a job description for that position, they would all be different. Some would emphasize some aspects of the job and de-emphasize other aspects. Others would emphasize different parts of the job, and those emphasis would differ depending on the state of the nation, the current events, and the current and past incumbents in the job. If job analysis was totally objective and a scientific process, all the job descriptions would be the same. Obviously, it's not the case. Job analysis activities leave room for interpretation and subjectivity, and that's a good thing. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not a good example. The job of the President of the United States is too complex. It changes all the time. That's true. But the basics of the job are the same. It requires certain skills and traits and experience to initially perform all of the duties. But the emphasis or weight of those skills, traits, and experiences is what changes with different situations. But isn't that the same with all jobs? We can readily see it in the president's job, but how about the jobs of parent? Isn't the job description of parent different today than it was in previous generations? Actually, doesn't the job description of a parent change as a child grows older? Parental responsibilities and tasks when a child is 2 years old are vastly different than when the child reaches 16. The job changes with time. The basics are the same, but the importance, emphasis, and weight of certain required skills and traits change. Why can't we just keep following the recipe? Because jobs keep changing. They keep changing with the internal and external environment, and thus we have stumbled onto one of the main problems with job analysis process. The results must be reviewed and modified regularly. I've worked in organizations where job descriptions and specifications were a decade old or more. The organization expressed expectations and requirements were outdated. When hiring, we were looking for things we needed a long time ago instead of what we need now, or let alone what we might anticipate needing in the future. Job analysis is not a task on a to do list that is checked off and forgotten. It's an ongoing process with real consequences. Finally, the job analysis can either be a useful tool that leads us in our quest to fill openings with the best people and pay all people fairly, or it can be a bureaucratic waste of time. Is job analysis a bureaucratic waste of time or a necessary function in an organization? The answer to those questions depends simply on what you do with the data you collect in the job analysis. Job analysis is a waste of time and an important function depending on the organization's investment put into the process. Let politics get into the process and it will quickly become a waste of time. Apply the data professionally and it will become a very useful management tool. When I worked for RCA, I was in charge of compensation. We conducted job analysis and job evaluations based on a point factor system, which has been in place for decades. The organization had job descriptions that were decades old. I jokingly told managers to tell me what pay grade they wanted the job to have, and I could get it there. Our job analysis process had evolved into a bureaucratic boondoggle. It was a waste of time and effort, but the bureaucracy required the activity. When working for the Noel Group, we developed a job analysis process with the help of outside consultants that was simple and very useful. It worked great and was very beneficial to the organization. Our job analysis allowed us to compare jobs within the organization and also within the marketplace. It provided consistency and stability in our pay system. So just like any other HR program, or sales program, or research program, or any other program for that matter, job analysis can be an important function that contributes much to the organization, or a weight around the organization's neck that helps strangle growth and encourages mediocrity. Remember, job analysis is merely collecting data on a subject job. That data results in job descriptions and job specifications. Garbage in, garbage out. The question is not, do we need the data? Of course we do. The need to know what people do or should be doing and what kinds of people we should hire to do those things. Needing the data is not a question. What we do with the data determines the value of the job analysis process. To put into context of home, do you need a personal or family budget? Well, absolutely you do. You should know how you're spending your money. You should know if your spending habits are good or bad. You should know if you are in good financial shape or standing on the brink of bankruptcy. But the real test of the effectiveness and usefulness of a budget process is what you do with the data. Do you use the data to formulate better spending habits? Do you use the data to plan for the future? Do you use the data to develop tools and processes of analysis that will improve your life? Or do you use the data merely to explain why you're on the brink of disaster to your spouse, parents, creditors, etc.? Do you use the data to provide inflexible barriers to new investment that may be beneficial? In other words, does your budget become a limiting factor that prevents necessary risk to reach success? What do you do with the data? That is the effectiveness question surrounding budgeting and around job analysis as well. My opinion is that job analysis is a necessary process. It's important, but it can get away from you and your organization, so take care in its development and management. How much detail to include in the data and how much the organization uses the data is a judgment call. And I agree, judgment is subjective. It is subjective application of objective data. Bottom line is, job analysis is boring, but important, as are many other important things in life. You got to do it. Might as well do it right.